Black girl has no defense, the judge laughed until the court fell silent. Amara Johnson stood outside the courthouse, holding her folder tightly against her chest as people hurried past her. The morning was bright, but she felt a heavy cloud over her. It was her first time inside a courtroom, and she had no lawyer beside her. She kept repeating to herself that she had done nothing wrong, that the truth would protect her, but fear still pressed against her ribs. She wished the system felt as simple as honesty, but deep down she knew this day would not be easy. She pulled in a slow breath before pushing open the large wooden doors. The hallway stretched wide and cold, filled with people in suits, security officers, and families waiting on benches. Everyone else seemed to know exactly where to go, but Amara walked carefully, scanning the signs on each door. Her heart beat faster each time someone looked at her, though most people did not pay attention. She felt alone, but she kept walking because she had no other choice. When she reached courtroom 3B, she stopped and adjusted the sleeves of her blouse. She had dressed as neatly as she could, hoping it would help her look prepared. Her hands trembled a little, so she pressed them against her folder until they became still. She whispered, "You can do this," although she was not sure she believed it yet. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than she expected. Rows of wooden benches filled the space, and a few people already sat waiting. Some were whispering quietly, some scrolling on their phones, and some just staring ahead. She walked toward an empty bench and sat down carefully, feeling the wooden seat cool beneath her. She kept her folder in her lap like a shield. A few minutes later, the judge entered and everyone stood. Amara rose slowly, almost missing the cue. She watched the judge take his seat, an older man with silver hair and a stern expression. He tapped something on his desk before looking over the room with mild impatience. When everyone sat again, the judge called the first case. Amara listened as other people stepped forward with their lawyers, speaking confidently or letting their attorneys speak for them. Each time a name was called, she imagined someone would stand beside her soon, but she already knew the truth. Her public defender had called her the previous evening to say he could no longer attend, giving her no explanation and no replacement. She had spent half the night searching online for how to speak in court. Nothing she read made her feel ready. A bailiff stepped closer and called her name. "Amara Johnson." Amara stood, her legs feeling unusually light. She walked to the front with quiet steps. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features and a confident smile, glanced at her as though already sure of the outcome. Amara avoided his eyes and faced the judge. The judge looked at the file in front of him and then at her. "Miss Johnson, it says here your counsel is not present." Amara swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor, my lawyer withdrew last night. I didn't have time to find someone else." The judge raised an eyebrow. "So you have no legal representation today?" There was a subtle shift in the room. A few people lifted their heads, sensing something unusual. Amara knew what many of them might be thinking. She was young, she was alone, and she did not look like someone who belonged at the front of a courtroom making arguments. The judge sighed lightly, though not loudly enough to seem unprofessional. Amara kept her voice steady. "I will represent myself today." A soft chuckle rose from the back of the room, followed by another. Even the judge allowed a small laugh, quick and sharp, as if he found the situation amusing before he could stop himself. He leaned back in his chair with a look that told her he doubted she knew what she was doing. "Well," he said, "this should be interesting." Amara felt her cheeks warm, but she did not look down. She stayed standing tall, even though her heart was beating hard. She knew people sometimes judged others before hearing them speak. She told herself not to take it personally, not today, not when she needed to be clear-headed. The prosecutor stepped forward with confidence. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to proceed. Given that Miss Johnson has no defense counsel, I trust we can move through this quickly." The prosecutor's tone felt too smooth, almost rehearsed, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Amara noticed his smile, not unkind, but certain of his advantage. She wondered how many cases he had handled, how many people he had spoken against. He probably expected her to stumble or freeze or give up halfway through, but she was not planning to give up. The judge nodded. "Very well, present your opening remarks." The prosecutor launched into his explanation. His words flowed easily, filling the room. He spoke about timelines, statements, and supposed contradictions. Every sentence sounded polished, like it had been practiced many times. Amara listened closely, trying not to feel overwhelmed. She had gone over her folder again and again, memorizing every piece of information she had. Still, Hearing the prosecutor speak so smoothly made her feel small, like her voice would not matter in the same way. People in the courtroom began reacting subtly, leaning forward, exchanging looks, raising their brows as if forming an opinion before she even had a chance to speak. Amara noticed it all but did not let her face show it. She reminded herself that the truth was on her side. She only needed to hold on until it was her turn. As the prosecutor finished, he stepped back with the air of someone who believed the work was nearly done. The judge turned toward Amara. "Miss Johnson, do you have a response?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." She opened her folder, but her hands shook slightly. She took a quiet breath to steady herself. She could feel eyes watching her, some curious, some doubtful. She reminded herself that she did not come here to impress anyone. She came to speak for herself when no one else would. She lifted her first page, ready to read, but the judge lifted a hand. "Before you begin, Miss Johnson, do you understand that representing yourself is highly challenging? The court cannot give you guidance." "I understand, Your Honor," she said softly but clearly. "But I can explain my side. I know what happened." There was a brief silence, not heavy but hesitant, as though the judge was deciding whether she would truly be able to manage this. Finally, he nodded, giving her permission to continue. Amara took another breath, her voice slightly stronger now. "Your Honor, I have evidence that has not been reviewed yet, documents and recordings that support my statements. I would like the chance to present them." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, surprised. The judge frowned slightly, looking down at the file. "Unreviewed evidence?" he asked. "Yes," Amara replied, her tone steady even though she felt the weight of the moment. "I brought copies, timestamps, and additional records." She held her folder a little higher, ready to show she was prepared even if she did not look like someone the court expected to be. Somewhere behind her, the whispering paused. The judge leaned forward, tapping his pen slowly. "We'll address that when it's time. You may proceed with your explanation." Amara nodded and began to speak. Her words were simple, honest, and careful, almost like she was guiding herself through a path she memorized. She explained her timeline, her actions, the documents she had brought. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply told the truth as clearly as she could. As she spoke, her earlier fear softened. She felt something new growing, confidence, not loud or bold, but steady like the slow rising of sunlight. She realized she knew her story better than anyone else in the room. She realized she had prepared more carefully than they expected, but she still saw the doubt in the judge's eyes and the slight impatience in his posture. She felt the prosecutor's stare like a quiet challenge. She knew she was still not being taken seriously, not yet. She knew she would need stronger proof to shift the atmosphere of the room. When she finished explaining the first portion of her statement, the judge nodded absently, as though he was listening but not fully convinced. The prosecutor prepared his papers, ready to counter her words. Amara returned to her seat quietly, noticing the small murmurs rise again in the gallery. She did not know what people were saying, but she knew none of it mattered. She had done the hardest part. She had spoken. She sat with her folder resting on her lap and whispered to herself again, but this time with a slightly stronger voice. "You can do this." She believed it a little more than before. And as the judge prepared to move forward, she felt the first small shift inside herself. A belief that today, she might be able to change more than just her case. She might change the way the room looked at her. She just didn't know yet how much the courtroom was about to change. Amara sat quietly as the judge looked over his papers. Even though she had spoken clearly, she sensed he still expected the prosecutor's version to make more sense than hers. She tried not to let that discourage her. She kept her fingers locked together to stop them from trembling. Her folder rested safely beside her, the evidence inside waiting for the right moment. She knew she had come prepared. All she needed was the chance to show it. The prosecutor stepped forward again. His confidence seemed even stronger than before, as if he believed her first explanation had not changed anything. He held a stack of documents and straightened them with a crisp motion. Then he turned to the judge, giving a small, polite nod. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the state would like to present its sequence of events." The judge gestured for him to continue. The prosecutor began speaking with a tone that sounded almost rehearsed, calm and firm. He talked about schedules, statements, written reports, and witness descriptions. Every word came out perfectly steady, giving the impression that everything he said must be correct simply because he said it so confidently. Some people in the courtroom slowly nodded along, following his rhythm. Others simply watched him, taking his certainty as proof that his version was the truth. Amara listened carefully, trying not to let her emotions rise. She knew some of the details he presented were incomplete or didn't show the full picture. Some parts were taken from moments that needed more context. She wanted to interrupt, to correct him, but she knew she had to wait politely until it was her turn again. The prosecutor continued, slowly building his explanation piece by piece like someone assembling a puzzle. But Amara knew that the picture he was creating was not the right one. It was missing important pieces she had brought with her. She glanced at her folder, reminding herself that the truth was still waiting there. At one moment, the prosecutor mentioned a timeline that she knew was incorrect. Her heart jumped, but she kept her face still. Another moment, he quoted a witness who had misunderstood something important. She bit the inside of her cheek to stay calm. If she reacted too strongly, she feared the judge might think she was emotional instead of prepared. But the hardest part came when the prosecutor looked directly at her and said, "Miss Johnson's claims do not match the consistency the state requires." A few people in the courtroom looked at her as if expecting her to look uncertain or embarrassed. She refused to give them that. She sat up straighter, kept her expression steady, and looked ahead. When the prosecutor finished, he stepped back with an air of satisfaction. It was as if he believed his words had already closed the door on the case. The judge leaned back slightly, making a brief note on his papers. The room felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if waiting to see whether Amara would still try to stand up against such a polished argument. The judge looked at her. "Miss Johnson, do you have anything to say in response?" Amara stood slowly. She felt her knees wobble at first, but she steadied herself. She held her folder against her stomach with both hands, letting its weight give her confidence. "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly. She took a moment before speaking again, gathering her thoughts. The courtroom grew quieter, almost as if it respected her pause. She looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then down at her papers. "The timeline the prosecutor presented is missing important information," she said. "I have documents and video footage that show a different sequence of events." The judge raised a brow slightly, but he did not interrupt. Encouraged by this, Amara continued. "I would like the court to look at these materials. They show where I was at the time mentioned. They show who else was present. They show the exact moments that matter." She flipped open her folder, revealing neatly organized pages. She held them carefully, making sure they did not shake. Her voice remained steady. "These documents match the timestamps from the recording, and the recording matches the statements I gave." She looked at the judge, hoping he could see her sincerity. "Everything fits together when the full information is shown." A small murmur rose in the back of the courtroom. Someone whispered, "She brought all that herself?" Another person leaned forward, trying to get a better view. Even the prosecutor shifted slightly, his confident posture relaxing just a little. No one had expected her to arrive so prepared. The judge tapped his pen again. "Is this new evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "I gathered it after the original report." "I brought copies for the court." The judge frowned thoughtfully. "The court usually reviews evidence before the hearing." "I understand, Your Honor," she said respectfully. "I didn't have a lawyer to submit it for me, but I did everything I could to bring the truth today." For the first time since she entered the courtroom, she could feel the room shifting, not fully, not dramatically, but slightly. The judge's expression softened just enough to show that he was listening. The prosecutor looked less certain. The gallery quieted down. She continued, "The video clearly shows where I was. The documents support the timeline. I believe they will answer the questions raised today." The judge glanced toward the clerk, who had been quietly observing the interaction. The clerk leaned forward and said, "Your Honor, it may be beneficial to review the materials. If they contain timestamps and relevant context, they could help clarify the case." The clerk's words carried weight. The judge sat straighter. "Very well," the judge said. "You may submit the documents to the clerk." Amara walked forward with careful steps. She placed the folder gently in the clerk's hands. The clerk nodded at her almost encouragingly. Amara returned to her seat, her heart pounding but in a new way, this time with cautious hope. The prosecutor watched with a look that mixed curiosity and disbelief. He tapped his fingers on his papers as if trying to remain confident, but his certainty did not look as solid as before. While the clerk flipped through the documents, the judge asked, Miss Johnson, you mentioned video footage. Do you have it available? Yes, Your Honor, she said quickly. I have it on a USB drive and on my phone as backup. Very prepared, the judge murmured almost to himself. The clerk looked up. Your Honor, the documents appear organized and contain matching timestamps. If the video supports these records, it may be relevant. The judge nodded slowly, then turned to Amara. We will view the video shortly. For now, please explain why this evidence was not in the initial report. Amara folded her hands together, keeping them still. When I first gave my statement, I did not know how important the timeline details were. I didn't have all the records with me at the time. Once I realized they could help, I collected everything. She paused, then added honestly, I asked my previous lawyer to submit them, but he stopped responding shortly before withdrawing. A few heads turned again. Her quiet, honest explanation seemed to touch something in the room. It wasn't dramatic, but it was sincere, and sincerity often carried more power than volume. The judge let out a slow breath. I see. The prosecutor shifted again, clearing his throat lightly. He looked like someone trying to hold on to confidence while small doubts slipped in around the edges. The judge leaned forward. Miss Johnson, if your evidence is as clear as you say, it will be considered carefully. The court does not dismiss details. Amara nodded gratefully. The prosecutor spoke up, trying to regain control. Your Honor, we must still verify the authenticity of these materials. Of course, the judge replied, and we will. As the clerk prepared the video equipment, the judge asked the courtroom to remain patient. Everyone settled back, though whispers moved through the benches like soft waves. People were no longer watching the prosecutor. They were watching Amara. For the first time since the hearing began, Amara felt the air around her shift again. Not fully supportive, but no longer dismissive. The room was beginning to see her not just as someone standing alone, but as someone who had put real effort into defending herself. She smoothed her skirt quietly, feeling a small rise of confidence inside her. She knew this moment mattered. The laughter she heard earlier no longer echoed in her mind. Instead, she heard her own voice, steady, hopeful. She whispered to herself again, "You can do this," but this time she believed it more deeply. The judge took a sip of water, preparing to move forward. The clerk connected the video drive. The prosecutor looked at the screen with a mixture of interest and tension. The gallery leaned in slightly, sensing something important was about to happen. And as the lights dimmed slightly for the screen to become visible, Amara felt something new settle over her. Not fear, not doubt, but a quiet strength she had not felt before. She knew the next moments could change everything, and she was ready. As the clerk prepared the video to play, the courtroom shifted into a deeper silence. The quiet felt different now, not heavy like before, not filled with doubt, but filled with curiosity. People leaned slightly forward, as if they sensed something meaningful was about to happen. The prosecutor adjusted his tie and looked toward the screen with a stiff, unreadable expression. The judge sat straighter, his hands folded neatly on the desk, waiting for the clerk's signal. Amara sat with her hands resting in her lap, though she could feel her heartbeat in every fingertip. She tried to breathe slowly, reminding herself she had checked this video so many times at home. She had watched it frame by frame, making sure every timestamp was visible and clear. She had practiced how she would explain it if anyone asked. But now that the moment was here, she felt both nervous and hopeful, like someone stepping onto a path they had carefully prepared but still feared to walk. The clerk finally announced, "The video is ready, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Play it." The lights dimmed slightly, and the screen brightened with the first frame. The video showed a wide walkway with a noticeable time and date marker at the bottom. Amara recognized it instantly. She remembered how many times she had visited this place, how she had crossed that walkway nearly every morning for work. Seeing it now felt strange, like looking back at a version of herself moving through a moment she never knew would become important. People in the courtroom watched quietly. The video played at normal speed, showing Amara walking through the camera's view, carrying a bag on her shoulder, checking her phone briefly, and then entering the building. There was nothing dramatic about the footage. No loud motion, no sudden changes, just simple, clear, ordinary movements that told the truth far better than complicated explanations could. Someone from the gallery whispered, "That's the same time they mentioned earlier." Another person nodded softly, and Amara heard a faint murmur spread through the room. She kept her eyes on the screen, but inside she felt a gentle wave of relief. The footage was doing exactly what she hoped. It was allowing people to see what words alone could not express. The prosecutor leaned closer, narrowing his eyes slightly. He did not speak, but Amara could tell he was searching for something he could question or challenge. He was used to controlling the narrative, and this moment took that control out of his hands. The judge gestured for the clerk to continue. The next section of the video showed the time moving forward. Amara appeared again, this time exiting the building while speaking to a coworker. Their conversation could not be heard, but the body language looked friendly and casual. The coworker waved goodbye and walked in the opposite direction. Amara walked toward a bus stop, checking her watch. The judge raised his eyebrows. "This matches the record she provided." The clerk nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, the timestamps align." Amara felt her chest warm with cautious hope. She watched the judge's expression closely. His earlier amusement seemed distant now. His posture no longer showed disbelief, but a more thoughtful attention. He looked like someone beginning to realize they had overlooked something important. When the video ended, the screen faded to black. The clerk paused the display and waited for further instructions. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have any comments at this point?" The prosecutor hesitated before answering. "Your Honor, while the video confirms her presence at the location, we must still verify authenticity, and it does not necessarily contradict all parts of the earlier statement." The judge nodded slightly. "We will verify, of course. But it does appear to offer relevant context." Amara watched the prosecutor shift his weight. His confidence was no longer as smooth as before, though he tried hard to maintain it. His expression carried a quiet tension, the kind that appeared when someone expected events to go one way but found themselves walking down an unexpected path. The judge turned to Amara. "Miss Johnson, do you have more evidence to present?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied gently. She stood and approached the table to retrieve another folder she had prepared. She had organized everything carefully, labeling each section so she wouldn't lose her place or fumble. She handed the folder to the clerk, who opened it and scanned the first few pages. "These are the employment records," Amara explained. "They show the hours I worked that day and confirm my clock-in and clock-out times." The judge nodded slowly, already glancing at the pages. "They seem detailed." "They come from the official system my workplace uses," she said, "and they match the times in the video." A few more whispers spread across the courtroom. People were not whispering doubt this time, they were whispering surprise. Amara continued softly. "I also have messages from my supervisor confirming I was present for a meeting during the time mentioned earlier." The prosecutor crossed his arms, as if trying to hold on to his previous certainty. But the longer Amara spoke, the harder it became for him to appear unaffected. The judge took another moment to read through the papers. Then he asked, "Miss Johnson, why were these materials not shared earlier?" Amara folded her hands in front of her, choosing her words carefully. "I tried, Your Honor, but I did not have a lawyer who could submit them for me. When my previous lawyer withdrew, I gathered everything myself." The judge's eyes lifted toward her, and this time Amara noticed something different there. Not annoyance, not impatience, but something closer to respect. Even if it was faint, it was there. He turned to the prosecutor. "Would you like to examine the evidence?" The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." But his voice no longer carried the same smooth confidence. The clerk handed him the folder. He flipped through the documents, scanning them quickly at first, then more slowly as certain details caught his attention. His eyebrows tightened slightly. He glanced back at the video screen, then at the papers, then at Amara. The room felt still, as if everyone was waiting for his reaction. After a moment, he closed the folder with a careful motion and looked up. "Your Honor, the documents appear to align with the timestamps." The judge leaned forward. "Do they conflict with any of your earlier statements?" The prosecutor paused. His silence spoke louder than any answer could. He took a small breath. "Not directly, Your Honor." A ripple of quiet surprise spread through the gallery. People exchanged looks, some with widened eyes, some with gentle nods. The once confident outline of the prosecutor's argument had begun to soften in the presence of clear facts. The judge looked at Amara again. "Miss Johnson, please continue if you have more to present." She nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." She walked back to her seat, feeling a soft warmth rise inside her chest. She could sense the room paying attention to her now, not out of curiosity, not because she stood alone, but because her words carried weight. People were seeing her not just as someone defending herself, but as someone who had carefully gathered the truth, piece by piece, with quiet determination. She took out the final set of documents. "Your Honor, these are my transportation receipts from the day. They show the times I used the bus system, and they match the moments seen in the video." The judge accepted the papers, looking more interested than ever. Amara continued softly, "All of this together shows where I was and what I was doing." There were moments in the earlier explanation that did not include this context. The judge nodded thoughtfully. "It seems you have prepared thoroughly." Amara lowered her gaze modestly. "I did my best, Your Honor." The courtroom was almost completely silent. Even the usual small noises, the shifting of feet, the rustling of paper, felt quieter than usual. People were listening intently, fully aware that something significant was unfolding. The prosecutor looked at the judge, then at Amara, and finally down at his papers again. His expression was no longer confident or certain. It was thoughtful, calculating, and slightly uneasy. He knew the direction of the case was shifting, and he was no longer guiding its course. The judge closed the folder gently and placed it on the bench. He looked directly at Amara, studying her face for a brief moment. "Miss Johnson," he said in a calm voice, "your presentation has been clear and organized. The material appears relevant and consistent." Amara felt a small rise in her throat, not fear but something closer to relief. A few people in the gallery nodded in quiet approval. The energy in the room had changed completely. The judge continued, "The court will review all the evidence thoroughly. For now, we will take a short recess." He tapped his gavel softly, signaling a break. Amara exhaled slowly, not realizing she had been holding so much tension in her body. She sat back down, placing her hands on her lap again. Her fingertips tingled, not from fear but from the release of it. As people stood and stretched, as the judge left the bench and the clerk began gathering the materials, Amara felt something she had not felt since the morning began. She felt seen. Not judged, not dismissed, not doubted, seen. She leaned back slightly and closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the kindness of that feeling settle in her chest. She knew the hearing was far from over. She knew more questions would come. There would be more discussions, more explanations, more careful steps to take. But she also knew something important had shifted. The courtroom was no longer laughing. It was listening. And for the first time, truly listening to her. When the judge called for a recess, the courtroom slowly came back to life with soft movement and murmurs. People stood up, stretched their arms, and stepped into the aisles. Some made their way toward the exits, planning to use the short break to get water or check their phones. Others stayed seated, looking thoughtful or curious as they whispered quietly to each other. It was clear that the direction of the hearing had shifted, and everyone felt it. Amara stayed seated for a moment, letting the change in atmosphere settle around her. The heaviness she carried that morning had not completely lifted, but something inside her felt lighter. She had walked into the courtroom alone, unsure if anyone would listen to her. Now she sensed that the room saw her differently. It wasn't full respect yet, not fully, but it was something like recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that she had spoken with clarity and that her evidence mattered. She took a slow breath and opened the small bottle of water she kept inside her bag. Her hands no longer trembled as much, and she managed a small sip without spilling. The cool water helped steady her thoughts. She reminded herself that the hearing was not finished, and she would still need to speak again. She would need the same calm and focus she had brought earlier, but for the first time, she believed she could do it. Across the room, the prosecutor stood near the wall, talking quietly with an assistant who had arrived during the recess. He held the folder containing Amara's evidence and pointed to parts of it as he spoke. However, his voice lacked the confidence he displayed earlier. His assistant nodded thoughtfully but didn't say much, as if the papers spoke loudly enough on their own. The clerk organized the documents on her desk, carefully separating each set of papers with colored tabs. Amara noticed how gentle and precise the clerk was, almost as if she understood the importance of keeping everything in clear order. Whenever the clerk glanced in Amara's direction, there was a subtle warmth in her expression, something like encouragement. After several minutes, the judge returned. The courtroom grew quiet again as everyone took their seats. The judge sat down with a composed expression, but he no longer looked impatient or amused. Instead, he looked thoughtful, ready to continue the hearing with more seriousness than before. He picked up a pen, clicked it once, and then said, "Let us resume." Everyone settled into silence. The judge cleared his throat. "Before we continue, I want to say that the evidence presented by Miss Johnson offers clarity that was not available earlier. It is the court's duty to consider all information fairly, no matter how it is introduced." Amara felt her heart lift gently at those words. They were simple, but they signaled a shift she had hoped for since the moment she stepped into the courtroom. The prosecutor nodded politely, though a faint tightness remained in his expression. He knew he needed to adjust his approach now. The air in the courtroom no longer carried the quiet assumption that his explanation was the only accurate one. The space felt more balanced. "Miss Johnson," the judge continued, "we will now review your statements again along with the new materials. Please take your place." Amara stood and walked toward the podium. Her steps were quiet and measured. She felt aware of every moment, every breath, every heartbeat, but she didn't feel afraid, not the way she had earlier. The courtroom felt more like a place where she belonged now, a place where her voice mattered. When she reached the podium, she placed her hands gently on its edges and waited for the judge's instruction. "Please summarize the connection between the video evidence and your timeline," the judge said. Amara nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." She began to speak, her voice clear and steady. She described how the video showed her arriving at work at the time she stated earlier. She explained the conversation captured on camera, the exit time, and the bus she took afterward. She connected each detail carefully, creating a smooth and simple picture that anyone could follow. People in the gallery leaned forward slightly, paying close attention. They were no longer whispering doubts or quick judgments. They were following her words, trying to understand the full story. When she finished her explanation, the judge turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have questions for Miss Johnson?" he asked. The prosecutor adjusted his papers and stepped forward. He looked at Amara respectfully, though a hint of discomfort remained on his face. It was clear he was choosing his words carefully now. "Miss Johnson," he began, "could you explain how you obtained the video footage?" "Yes," she said. "The security office at the building provided it when I requested it. They keep recordings for several weeks. I explained my situation and they gave me a copy." The prosecutor nodded slowly. "And the employment records, did you request those as well?" "Yes," she replied. "My supervisor sent them to me after I asked. These records match the company's system." The prosecutor paused. He looked at the documents again and then back at Amara. His tone softened slightly. "And you gathered all of this after your first statement?" "Yes," she said honestly. "At first, I didn't know what details were most important. Once I understood more clearly, I collected everything I could." The prosecutor nodded once more, then stepped back. "No further questions at this moment, Your Honor." The judge studied Amara for a brief moment before saying, "Miss Johnson, you may take your seat." She returned to her bench, feeling a soft comfort settle in her shoulders. She had answered each question calmly. She had not stumbled. She had not hesitated. She had shown the truth, and people were beginning to accept it. The judge then asked the prosecutor to present any remaining points. The prosecutor walked back to the front of the courtroom. He looked composed, but there was a gentler tone in his voice now, less confident, more cautious. "Your Honor," he said, "the state acknowledges that the new information requires further review." While the earlier timeline was based on available statements, this material provides additional context. The judge nodded. "It does. For now," the prosecutor continued, "I will not challenge the timestamps until verification is complete." The judge leaned forward slightly. "A wise choice." A few quiet reactions rippled through the gallery. People exchanged subtle looks. Some nodded, pleased with the fairness they were seeing. Others simply watched with interest, sensing the importance of the moment. The prosecutor stepped back and the judge turned to the clerk. "Please prepare the materials for official examination," he instructed. The clerk responded with a quiet, "Yes, Your Honor," and began sorting the documents into separate folders. Then the judge addressed the courtroom. "The evidence Miss Johnson has provided brings new clarity to the case. The court must consider all information carefully before concluding any matter. Therefore, we will take a moment to review the materials once more before proceeding." A soft wave of silence moved through the room again. This silence felt different from the earlier ones. It was not filled with doubt. It was filled with thought, with reflection, with recognition that something meaningful was happening. The judge began reading through the documents again. He read slowly with focus, occasionally pausing to check a timestamp or compare a detail. His brows were slightly furrowed, not in frustration but in concentration. He looked like someone who wanted to make sure every piece of information was understood correctly. The prosecutor watched quietly. His earlier certainty had been replaced by a more thoughtful expression. He seemed to realize that this hearing was no longer a simple matter. It required patience and fairness. He glanced at Amara a few times, as if acknowledging the effort she put into gathering the truth. Amara sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the judge carefully. She did not speak. She did not move much. She simply waited, trusting that she had done everything she could. She felt a soft warmth in her chest, a feeling that came from being honest and prepared. She felt proud, not loudly, not boastfully, but quietly in a way that gave her strength. After several minutes, the judge looked up. He began writing notes, slowly at first, then with more confidence. He wrote for a long moment, and the sound of his pen moving across the paper filled the room with a gentle rhythm. At last, he placed his pen down and looked at both parties. "Miss Johnson," he said, turning his attention to her, "the evidence you presented provides strong support for your statements. The clarity and consistency of your materials have changed the direction of this hearing." Amara felt her breath catch for a moment. Not in fear, this time it was something close to gratitude. The judge continued, "The courtroom will remain quiet as we proceed to the next phase." As he spoke, the room became completely still. Even the small sounds that usually filled a courtroom, the shuffling of papers, the tapping of feet, seemed to fade. People leaned in slightly, wanting to hear every word. The judge looked at Amara again, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was something unmistakable in his expression. Respect. It was subtle, but it was there, an acknowledgement of her effort, her clarity, her calm strength. Amara lowered her gaze softly, feeling her eyes warm with quiet emotion. She blinked once, steadying herself. She wanted to remain composed. She wanted to show that she appreciated the judge's recognition without losing her calm. The air in the courtroom felt different now, lighter, clearer. The earlier amusement that had filled the judge's voice was gone. The quiet chuckles that had risen from the gallery at the beginning of the hearing had disappeared. Now the room held something far more powerful than laughter. It held silence. Not empty silence, not dismissive silence, but meaningful silence. The kind that appears when the truth finally becomes visible. The kind that makes people reflect on what they assumed earlier. The kind that changes the entire atmosphere without a single dramatic moment. Amara sat still, letting the silence settle inside her. She felt stronger than she ever had that day. She felt understood. And as the judge prepared to speak the final words of the session, everyone in the courtroom sensed the same thing. The silence was no longer against her. It was for her. And it was speaking louder than anything else in the room. The courtroom was completely silent as the judge prepared to speak again. The air felt calm but full of meaning, like everyone was waiting for a moment they knew would shape the rest of the day. Amara kept her hands still in her lap and tried to breathe slowly. She didn't know exactly what the judge would say, but she could feel that something important was coming. She could feel a quiet shift, not just in the judge, but in everyone in the room. The judge took a slow breath and lifted the papers in front of him. "After reviewing all the evidence," he began, "and after hearing both sides speak today, the court has reached a conclusion." Every person in the courtroom straightened their posture at once. Even the prosecutor looked fully attentive, the uncertainty he had shown earlier returning to his expression. The clerk paused her work and folded her hands neatly, ready to listen. Amara's heart beat softly but steadily. She reminded herself that she had shown the truth clearly. She had spoken calmly. She had done everything she could. Now she simply had to trust the process. The judge continued in a calm voice. "The original statements created a picture that did not reflect the full truth. The new evidence provided by Miss Johnson fills in important gaps and aligns the timeline in a clear and consistent way." Soft murmurs rose from the gallery. People glanced at each other, many nodding gently as if they were agreeing with the judge's words. The atmosphere felt warm, supportive, and full of a quiet admiration for Amara's effort. The judge glanced at Amara. His eyes held a calm seriousness, but they also held something new, understanding. "Miss Johnson," he said, "I acknowledge that you were placed in a difficult position today. You appeared in court without legal counsel, and yet you presented your case with remarkable preparation and clarity. Amara felt her breath catch for a moment. She lowered her gaze slightly to steady her emotions. She didn't want to show tears, even grateful ones, but she couldn't deny the warmth she felt. The judge continued, "The court must always remain fair, and fairness requires us to look beyond assumptions. Your materials show that earlier conclusions would have been incorrect." Another wave of murmurs passed through the room, this time filled with quiet approval. The judge picked up a few papers, glanced at them one last time, and then set them down. "Based on the evidence, the case against Miss Johnson is dismissed." The room instantly shifted. Some people released small breaths of relief. Others nodded firmly, as if they knew this outcome was the right one. The clerk looked up with a soft, satisfied smile. Even the prosecutor, though surprised, gave a respectful nod. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked at Amara again, and his voice softened slightly. "Miss Johnson, I owe you a sincere acknowledgement." The courtroom grew even more silent, the moment becoming almost delicate. "When you first stated you would represent yourself today," the judge said, "I underestimated your ability. I made a quick assumption, and that assumption was unfair." Amara felt her throat tighten. She kept her posture straight, but she could feel the emotion rising gently in her chest. The judge continued, "Your patience, your organization, and your commitment to presenting the truth have shown that every person deserves to be heard with an open mind, no matter how things may appear at the start." A soft, emotional hush moved through the gallery. People watched Amara with kind, quiet expressions. The energy in the room was no longer tense or uncertain. It was warm, thoughtful, and full of respect. The judge added carefully, "I should not have assumed the outcome before listening fully." "For that, Miss Johnson, you have my apology." The courtroom fell completely still. An apology from a judge was rare, unexpected, powerful, and sincere. Amara felt her eyes grow warm, but she blinked gently, letting her breath steady her heart. She did not want to break the moment with tears, but she felt deeply moved. She had walked into the courtroom feeling alone and unseen. Now, she stood in a room where her efforts had not only protected her, but had also opened the judge's heart to greater understanding. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but every word carried her gratitude. The judge nodded. "You have shown admirable strength today." He turned to the prosecutor. "The court encourages the state to review its process more thoroughly in cases that rely on limited information." The prosecutor bowed his head slightly. "Yes, Your Honor, I will take that into account." His voice was respectful, and although his earlier confidence had shifted, it seemed he had gained something important too, a new understanding of the importance of thoroughness and fairness. When the official closing moments of the hearing ended, the judge stood and left the bench. The courtroom buzzed with gentle conversation as people stood and gathered their belongings. The clerk began organizing the files again with neat precision. The prosecutor packed his papers without the stiffness he had shown earlier. Amara remained seated for a moment, allowing the relief to wash over her slowly. She didn't rush to stand or speak. She wanted to feel the weight of the moment, the calm that filled her now that the truth had been recognized. She felt as though a quiet light had opened inside her, one built from resilience, honesty, and patience. A woman from the gallery approached her quietly. "You did very well today," she said softly. "Your courage was wonderful to see." Amara offered a gentle smile. "Thank you." Another person approached, a man who had been sitting near the back. "You spoke clearly," he said. "You stayed calm even when things were difficult." "That takes real strength." Amara felt grateful for his kindness. "I appreciate that," she said. The prosecutor approached next. His usual confident posture was softer now, and his tone was sincere. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly, "your presentation was impressive. I hope you feel proud of how you handled today." Amara nodded politely. "Thank you." He offered her a respectful nod before stepping away. As she gathered her things, the clerk approached her with a gentle smile. "You stayed patient and organized," the clerk said kindly. "You should feel very proud." "I do," Amara said softly. The clerk nodded warmly and returned to her desk. When Amara finally stepped out of the courtroom, she felt the sunlight touch her face. It felt brighter than it had that morning, as if the world itself had shifted a little. She took a slow breath and closed her eyes, letting the warmth settle on her skin. She walked down the courthouse steps with quiet confidence. Each step felt lighter, freer, filled with a sense of accomplishment she had earned through patience and truth. She was not leaving the courthouse as the same person who had entered earlier. She was leaving as someone who had fought for her voice and won, not through loudness or anger, but through clarity, truth, and calm strength. As she reached the bottom step, she paused for a moment, letting her gaze drift across the street. Life around her moved normally, cars passing, people walking, birds fluttering across the sky. It felt peaceful. It felt steady. It felt like a moment she would remember for a long time. She thought back to the judge's words, his apology, his recognition, his sincerity. She thought about how deeply the courtroom had changed from the start of the hearing until the end. It reminded her that sometimes the world needed time to see people clearly. But once it did, once truth became visible, even quiet voices could lead to great understanding. She hugged her folder gently against her chest, not because she needed it now, but because it reminded her of the effort she had put into protecting herself. It reminded her that even when she felt alone, she had found strength inside herself to keep going. As she took her first step toward the sidewalk, she whispered softly, "I did it." It wasn't a loud statement. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It was for her, her own quiet celebration, her own gentle acknowledgement of everything she had overcome. She continued walking with a peaceful smile, her heart steady and hopeful. She knew challenges would come again someday. Life always brought new tests. But now she also knew something she would never forget. She could stand in a room filled with doubt and still bring the truth forward. She could hold her ground without raising her voice. She could change the course of a moment simply by believing in herself, and she could do all of this with calm, simple courage. The courtroom had fallen silent earlier, not because of fear or confusion, but because the truth had finally spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. And that silence, gentle, powerful, and full of meaning, was the moment that changed everything for Amara.